first time in Texas. It's great to be here. Thank you guys so much for having me. Thank you to Lizzie for that really nice introduction. I'm an illustrator. And I imagine there might be some of you who don't know who I am, and as Lizzie said, I have a really common name. I'm from Sydney. I live in Amsterdam now, and I've been working professionally for the past 12 years as a commercial illustrator and an artist. About half that time I've been working as a freelance illustrator, and I describe my career thus far as like a combination of trial and error, and then repeating those errors again and again. But I find that's kind of how I learn most of the things. This is a combination of kind of my work. It's a combination of bright colors, restricted palettes, reduced compositions, geometry, pattern, animation, and over the past few years I've been doing some really fun things with some really cool brands, but also I've been doing a lot of cool things for myself, which I think is just as important. So that's a little about me, but I want to kind of talk you through how I got here, in a really quiet town of 21 million people called New Delhi. Anybody heard of it? But I didn't really live there, actually. I grew up in the middle. I loved to draw growing up. I loved the process of it, and with any school project, I'd make the opportunity to try and draw something for it. But the problem was I was so insanely jealous of the kids who could draw, but I just didn't have the patience or the aptitude or the discipline to practice it. I just wanted to be good now, or even yesterday. So I learned from that experience pretty young that there's always more than one way to do something. And I messed around with Flash for a few years, no particular goals. These are some cringy landing pages that I made in this crash course in digital design. And that's when I first met Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop. And it was up until this point, I was still making things in Macromedia Flash, just landing pages, still mainly. But that's where this love affair with Adobe Illustrator began, and all the things I could not do in Illustrator, I spent all my time learning. All the things I could not do in Flash, I spent all my time learning in Illustrator. What spurred me on through this whole process was finding online art communities. Just kind of listening to you guys introduce all the different programs that you have at the start. I'm so jealous because I kind of wish I had something like this when I first started out. So I looked out onto communities like DeviantArt and DevCore to find friends, find people as weird as me, because I didn't really have a lot of people in Western Sydney who wanted to make vector art. They wanted to skateboard and do other cool things. So the internet became a way where I shared and kind of received critique on all the work that I did. This is a glimpse into DevCore, which is this kind of restricted art community that I joined. But I was digitally surrounded by were pretty diverse. There were a group of people from a broad range of ages. Some people were making amazing work and had barely left high school. Some were working professionally in the field. Again, had never met any of them in person, but just came to trust these digital avatars that just represented. Okay, I've graduated. I was in Sydney. I decided that I wanted to move to Melbourne. Melbourne's about 1,000 kilometers south. And the reason I wanted to move to Melbourne is because I think it's the creative capital of Australia. And I remember venturing out, and I knew I'd be competing with other fresh graduates who were actually qualified to be working in graphic design, and that was really, really daunting for me. I was rejected a lot, and it made sense. I was applying for a graphic design job with a folio full of illustrations that I'd made in my bedroom. And I just wanted to get my foot in the door, even if it meant just making coffee or just hanging out. So I just kept trying and trying. And eventually, somehow, I managed to land a dream job at a studio called Cube Construct. It wasn't just a design studio, they did lots of different things. They did 3D and set builds and painting. And so this is like a much, much younger me working on a set build, which we drew over in post. So it was a really cool learning experience for me. I'd only made things online and shared them with people online. So on my first day, it was kind of a surprise to me that we'd be working on a clothing line for MTV. And it was also quite bizarre for me because I'd never really understood the concept of a creative director. I was like, wait, you're gonna tell me to do what? Everything. But I think So these are some things I was making at the time. I was really inspired and influenced by the really detailed work that I'd see on these online art communities. Lacked motivation, which to be honest, roughly translates to I'm just too impatient. But I think, the point of asking myself these questions, what is stopping you from making personal work? And trying to identify these problems was also just a way of me acknowledging what my habits are. And by doing so, I really wanted to try and figure out a way to overcome them. They have to be super intricate and detailed. And if you don't have enough time in the day, maybe let's work with the little time that you do have in the day. What if I set myself a time limit and that it absolutely has to be done by then? And so in response to these things, I created a self-initiated project which could work within those parameters. And all of this kind of led to a daily project that I started back then called the Daily Quickies. And it was basically all the rage back then, doing a daily illustration project, but it was really important for me. It was a daily illustration project where, based on the problems of time and detail, I set myself 1 hour a day. I only used line work, and I only used one color. And I did it every day for a year. And working with these restrictions allowed me to keep making things for myself. It also meant I couldn't overthink things, and working with a finite amount of time made me a far more agile illustrator. By simplifying my work and adding a time limit, I became more focused on communicating an idea rather than just making an illustration for the sake of it. And so some days they were really successful. They were mostly puns. So we've got chain smoking and snail mail. Thank you. Some days they were really successful. I was really good at capturing my procrastination visually. And then other days they were crap. Other days I had nothing, and I just thought, screw it, I'll just draw a car. But that was the point. I still did something, and that was the key takeaway from that. I think not every day is going to be perfect, and that's one of the big takeaways I took from that project. But ultimately, I felt so much more connected to my work, and it was feeding back to me. I started and finished something for myself every single day. And while this project is really, really old, it marks a bit of a milestone for me because it came out of a time where I was really, really unwell. But I took away 3 big lessons from this entire project. The first is make it personal. The effect of a personal project as a creative, I think that one of the most perfect things you can do for yourself. It's a self-indulgence that I think you need to have from time to time. And it doesn't matter how good the personal project is or what its purpose is, but after a day of replying to emails, dealing with client feedback, this is just a healthy reminder to yourself that you exist, and for this task, you're in control. My second takeaway, if you probably haven't noticed already, was learning my own bad habits. So impatience was one of mine, and it's really helped me define a style. I was able to identify what is basically my greatest strength and also my greatest weakness, my impatience. In hindsight, I think my impatience was probably really obvious and has plagued my ability to be productive for a really long time. Creating some constraints to work within helped me work around it, or at least keep interested. I think it would probably be the best way to describe the way I do, describe the work that I make. It's kind of a product of constraints and my impatience. And the third was that because I actually enjoyed my work, it showed and people noticed that too. What I took away was a better understanding of myself, stopped making work that I felt others would like to see, and began making work I actually wanted to make. And it shows, people started to respond because it felt more authentic. It felt like a pure reflection of me. It was because of this project I was noticed by a future creative director, and off the back of this I landed a full-time job in New York at an amazing design studio called Vault 49. Anybody know Vault 49? Nice. At the time, and I found it really fascinating. It really changed my perception of how to work. I felt like I needed to add, I think I came from a background where I felt like I needed to add more to add value. But I think this revised approach challenged me to work with as few restricted ingredients as possible. And these are some of the early experiments I did. This is from a series called Late Night Color Play. I'd come home from Vault 49 and do exactly that. It was late, it was night, and I played with color. I know, genius, right? Thank God I'm not a copywriter, right? Functional, everything in the piece had to be there for a reason. And it almost became kind of like solving a puzzle. Sometimes coloring them was like a puzzle. If you put one bit of color in the wrong place, you'd break the illustration. And I loved that challenge, focusing on fewer ingredients in a reductive way and trying to convey a simple idea. And I think it's also coming from this background of impatience, simplifying the elements allowed me to focus a lot more. I found it easy to concentrate on concept, composition, color, all the things that I felt like I didn't have the opportunity to learn in university. I kind of learned the other way around. So again, similar to the daily quickies, by imposing restrictions, I was able to find that I responded better to working within constraints rather than just having an open brief. Has anyone ever been given an open brief? They're the worst, right? So I think living within this aesthetic and kind of setting these overarching themes has allowed me to develop my work in a far more methodical, incremental, step-by-step way. And so where I used to, jump around a lot before, now I tell myself, stay a while. What's your rush? Let's tweak things, let's play with things, let's increment. But the irony is my impatience never really disappeared, and it manages to manifest in different ways. So next thing you know, we moved to Tokyo. We'd been living in New York for 4 years and we loved every minute of it. But we'd made a great group of friends, we had a routine, we could have easily stayed there for the rest of our lives. But it's almost that comfort in the routine that made us uncomfortable. And my partner and I decided that we wanted a new challenge, a sadistic one, because we quit our jobs, returned to freelance, and moved to Japan, as you do. Everybody else, you've had your Japan phase, right? So when we moved to Tokyo, we didn't know anybody, didn't know Japanese. Crazy. I still don't know how we did it, but I think it was completely worth it for the experience that we wanted out of it. If we were, tired of being comfortable, this was the complete opposite of that. Every day was a different adventure. Every single experience was something new. Going to the grocery store and trying to work out what vegetable you're actually buying, going to the bank and trying to deposit a check. Everything was brand new. But part of the joy in being in a different country, especially Japan, meant that everything was so far removed from the life that we had known so far. And when everything is new, you find inspiration in the simplest and most banal of tasks, like taking the train. This probably looks like a train everywhere now though, so I don't know if that's cultural. I think one of the coolest things was I got to work on this project for Airbnb while I was living in Tokyo, and they asked the illustrator to create a kind of location-based poster, and seeing Tokyo from the eyes of an expat allowed me to distill these ideas in a really interesting way. I think the isolation of being lost in translation perpetually made Tokyo also quite a lonely place. But the upside is that I found myself immersing myself in my work so much more, and a lot of Japanese influences found their way into my work. Part of the beauty of the time that we had there was that it allowed me to evolve my work and also how I made it. Much like resetting and being in a new place, I wanted to reset how I approach creative work, my process as well. And the way I did that was by challenging myself with new programs and new tools, challenging the original kind of design process, and modeled in 3D. It's already got wheels. You just need to give it a push. And I felt like working with a pattern-based style, it really lent itself to movement. So where things used to be static, they started to move in just really, really simple ways. And what's more is I think I just happened to get really, really lucky with the timing too, because GIFs had started to have their resurgence, and with every project that came through the door, everybody wanted some sort of animated element to a project. So this was for Sagmeister and Walsh, where I combined the two aspects, and it just became a natural kind of extension of my style. There's something else from the same project which might look a little familiar, like Forbidden Fruit. The foundation, for the animation was already there. It was just about making it move. And all of a sudden, my work took on a whole new personality. So being associated with style has always been a goal, but evolving and iterating has been really, really important to me, to stay interested and engaged, especially because I work alone. I became obsessed with two things. The first was learning something new every single year, whether that's a new program or a new skill. And two is seeing my work in different contexts and applications outside of the screen. So where New York might have been about me finding my voice, I think Tokyo became about learning how to use my voice. For example, in this case, I was using pattern, but I kind of dreamed up this idea of imagining a pair of socks which looked different depending on the perspective that you viewed it at. So this is still one pair of socks, but depending on the angle, they look kind of different. So I think seeing my work on the screen just wasn't enough for me anymore. It was all about kind of learning something new along the way. This is my first solo exhibition in Melbourne, in Australia, and it was called Potluck. And to date is the most kind of conceptual, self-initiated project I've ever done, because it allowed me to think as an artist rather than just simply as a designer. And the body of work was inspired by gestures and objects which we use as tokens of good luck. It was this kind of exploration into how we empowered these gestures and tokens and empower them with meaning. And so I kind of called on a broad kind of based, a broad reference of different cultures and inspired by different kind of people's approaches to luck. I just found that luck was such a ubiquitous thing because everybody in every culture believes in it in some way or wants to believe in it. And funnily enough, that's actually where Morning Glory, which is the flower illustration, that's where the splash screen for Adobe, the Adobe Illustrator splash screen came from. So I guess I got lucky there. I think the context has had such a big effect on how someone might experience your work. So while my illustration career, started to gain momentum, I tried to make a really conscious effort to take on projects where my work would live beyond just the screen. So while this illustration and animation was created for the IMAX Theatre in Melbourne, but the work in a different scale. I think slowly building up a folio of references where my work lived off the screen demonstrated that I could do more than just on-screen animation and on-screen illustration. And I think it allowed brands to take notice of that too, and also imagine what an artist collaboration might look like. So this was a packaging collaboration that I did for a Japanese brand called SK2. And it was a bit of a milestone as well because it was the first time that they'd actually wanted me to sign it, which I was like, why? Why do you want me to sign it? But I think it was kind of like signaling the point where it's like, oh, like you're transitioning and you're kind of towing the line between becoming an artist and an illustrator. And that's just a world I love living in. And while those are cool, like branding illustrations that I love working on, I still love working in different technologies because at the end of the day, I'm a nerd at heart. And so these are some animated 3D objects that I designed for a music festival in Australia called Sugar Mountain. But the really cool thing about the project was we converted these illustrations into augmented reality. So this dancing illustration of me, so basically these illustrations worked as triggers around the design space. And when you looked at them through your device, they would come to life with these 3D models. And so we decorated the entire stage with these really, really cool augmented reality models. And it looks something like this. Again, the most rewarding thing here was that my existing style was kind of prevailing, but translating my work into a completely new and different environment allowed people to interact with the work in just a new and refreshing way. I think one of my favorite things about working within constraints also forces me to question my routines and question them often. So as you've probably noticed, I like pattern. And we chose Amsterdam because the pace is completely different. It's quieter, it's smaller, there's less than 1 million people in Amsterdam. You ride everywhere, you see people often. But I think by now we'd also traveled so much that moving wasn't necessarily daunting. We learned that there are certain things that you go through every time you experience something new, whether it's moving to a new place or learning a new skill. And I think in a roundabout way, that became my approach for things, is that there's always that crappy bit at the start, but eventually it pays off. And I think challenging myself often to learn something new has led me to be a lot more confident in my ability and my potential. I think a byproduct of forcing myself off the screen, and sharing it as often as I do, has led to a broader range of projects coming in, rather than just me working in a restricted field like illustration. And it's kind of led to a point where I'm more excited to kind of actively step out of my comfort zone, especially if it means that I can learn something new. So a project in particular that I want to talk about is this one that I did for Nike, which was for the recent Winter Olympics in Korea. And so up until then, as you've probably seen, all of my animations so far are pretty simple. Well, I mean, simple, but they're just animated patterns essentially. And so Nike reached out and said, hey, we have this really complicated illustration, we thought of you. And I didn't understand why. And my kind of initial knee-jerk reaction was just to say no, because they wanted a flying camera running through the streets of Seoul with ice skaters, boxes, lots of architecture, and so on. And nothing that looked like anything in my portfolio. So naturally I said yes, as you do. But I think part of the reason that I said yes was having a creative team to support it. The creative team behind Nike had a vision, and they also had a belief in my ability, so I was more inclined to say yes. And the way I overcame this was kind of thinking of this mega animation as just a bunch of smaller animations put together, right? And then I'd work out how to make things later. Again, do not recommend. But I'll do it again. And this was the kind of final result. It was a really fun and exhaustive process, as you can imagine, but these are the kinds of projects that give me the most satisfaction. I challenged myself, I learned something new, and I had a lot of new skills to add to my skill set. Also, I don't know if you noticed, but the pattern obsession continues because it's a seamless loop as well. It's also worth noting that this whole project was sketched, animated, modeled, rendered on a laptop. Part of what's helped me inform my style is my stripped back aesthetic, and it's just kind of one of the other constraints that I impose on my work. I love being mobile, I love being able to work remotely, and it's kind of just it's essentially a reflection of my tendencies. So my office fits in my backpack, which is not always good. Clients love it. But I think one of the things I love most about working with pattern is its versatility. You can dial it all the way up and make really, really complicated visuals like that animation. Or you can strip things back and make something really bold and simple, like this 1,000-piece puzzle. That's not simple. So this was a puzzle that I made in collaboration with Clemens Habicht, and it's I love the groans every time. So, a full disclosure, this is not a time lapse of me putting this together, but if you follow me on Instagram, there is a story of me putting it together over the course of 5 weeks. And then when I say me putting it together, I mean my wife putting it together. I'm just there for moral support. If anybody has this and is stuck, I highly recommend you talk to her. But again, a great example of seeing your work in a different way, even if you're torturing other people. So as you can see, I still haven't really found a way to stop my impatience. Instead it's kind of just this ongoing journey of finding different ways to channel it. I describe it as just a variety of different alter egos that I have within a single style. So one of the best pieces of advice I received is from a friend and a really talented illustrator. He's a Romanian illustrator, and the guy I collaborated with at the top of the presentation. His name's Matei, and it was during our time when we were in depth core, and we used to chat back and forth on MSN Messenger. And I remember just lamenting to him. I was still in university. I didn't really know if I could be an illustrator, and I I said, Matei, I just wish I could draw like everybody else. I just wish I could draw like all the other illustrators that I was a fan of. And he gave me this advice, or he just said this thing that really stuck with me. He said, Karan, why draw like everyone when no one draws like you? And at the start of the talk, I mentioned how hard it is to feel unique, especially in a world where we're kind of currently surrounded and saturated. But I think that comes from celebrating your own quirks and differences and highlighting them, whether they're good or bad. Because as much as your identity is a bunch of things that you choose, it's also a bunch of things that you can't control. And we respond to things around us, from our background to our environments. They feed into us, they help mold us, and I believe that we should lean in and embrace them as much as we can. Thank you guys so much for having me.